I was trained to believe that trails are fixed things, cut into the land, measured, logged, maintained. They don't wander, they don't drift. And trail markers, they don't move. That's the first thing they teach you at the academy. Not officially, not written down. But every ranger knows it. If a marker changes position, it means a storm, or vandals, or your memory is wrong. It is never the marker. I'm recording this now because I can't carry it anymore. Because every time I close my eyes, I'm back there, standing in the trees, staring at a sign that wasn't there the day before, telling myself the same thing over and over again. Not real. Real. Not real. Before I say anything else, before I go any further, let me ask you something. If you're listening to this on YouTube right now, do me a favor, check that you're subscribed. These stories don't stay visible forever, and neither do the people who tell them. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your city, your country, your time zone. Because what happened to me didn't care where I was from, only that I was there. I've been a National Park Service ranger for 12 years. Search and rescue, backcountry patrol, missing persons, Yosemite National Park. People think Yosemite is postcard beautiful. Granite cliffs, waterfalls, clean air. They don't talk about how quiet it gets once you're past the viewpoint, how sound doesn't echo the way it should, how the forest swallows distance. There are places where your radio signal dies in straight lines, places where compasses hesitate, places where the map stays correct, but the land doesn't agree. Every ranger has stories they don't file reports for. Boot prints that stop, voices heard once and never again, trails that feel longer on the way back. You learn to ignore those things. You have to. The incident I'm about to describe wasn't supposed to be an incident at all. It was a routine follow-up. A missing hiker. Solo. Late 20s. No sign of foul play. Happens more than people think. The trail he was last seen on is one I know better than my own neighborhood. I've walked it in fog, in snow, in smoke-filled summers when the sky turned orange and the sun looked wrong. I could draw it from memory. Which is why I noticed immediately when something was off. It was subtle at first. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you'd put in a story. A trail marker, standard MPS design, weathered wood, reflective paint, was standing where bare rock should have been. Just a few feet off. Just enough to register as a mistake. I remember thinking someone had relocated it. Or maybe I was misremembering. That happens too. But the thing is, I remember stopping. I remember touching the post. I remember the splinters in the wood, and I remember turning around 10 minutes later to check it again. It wasn't there. In its place was another marker. Same style, same height, pointing in a different direction. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel afraid. I felt annoyed. Because when you work in a place like Yosemite long enough, you start believing the land is predictable if you respect it. That belief kept me walking. What I didn't know then, what no one tells you, is that some trails aren't built to guide people out. Some trails are built to keep track. I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying it because if you hike long enough, if you follow signs long enough, you start trusting them more than yourself. And that's where the problem begins. I should also tell you this up front, before you decide whether to keep listening. Officially, I was missing for 3 days. Unaccounted for. My radio last pinged near a section of forest that doesn't exist on any current map. They found me sitting on a rock near the road. Dehydrated. Confused. Unable to explain where I'd been. That's what the report says. What the report doesn't say is that when I woke up, my boots were worn down in a pattern I didn't recognize. Or that my map had new markings on it. Or that the trail marker nearest the ranger station had fresh paint on it. Same handwriting as mine. Not real. Real. not real. I've avoided that section of the park ever since. I reroute patrols. I volunteer for desk duty. I tell new rangers to trust their maps, not their instincts. But sometimes, when the fog rolls in just right, I can see it from the edge of the lot. A trail marker where there shouldn't be one. Waiting. If you've ever hiked in Yosemite, really hiked, past the crowds, then you already know this park doesn't need monsters. It has patience. And if you're still listening, if you're still here with me, then I need you to understand something before we go any further. I didn't get lost. I followed the trail exactly as it was marked. The call came in just after sunrise. Not the dramatic kind of sunrise people take photos of. Not the kind that makes Yosemite look like a promise. This was the pale, flat kind. The kind that makes everything feel unfinished. Low light, long shadows, cold air settling in the valleys like something poured there. Dispatch kept it short. Solo hiker. Male. Late 20s. Day pack. Last confirmed sighting 2 days ago at a trailhead on the west side. His car was still there. No note. No obvious signs of injury. No credit card activity. Phone last pinged somewhere in the park, then died. Standard. My supervisor slid the paper across the desk like he wanted it off his hands. I remember the hiker's name, but I'm not going to say it here. Not because I'm protecting him, because names have weight in places like this. And the longer you work in Yosemite, the more you notice that certain names come up more than once. On reports, on old plaques, on carved wood, on the underside of benches where nobody thinks to look. I took the file. I took the keys. I took the radio. Routine. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove out. Routine. The road out to the trailhead was empty. Not empty like a quiet street. Empty like a closed building. Like nobody was supposed to be there yet. The fog was thick enough that the trees on either side of the road looked like silhouettes cut from paper. The kind of fog that doesn't drift so much as hover, holding its shape. Yosemite has a way of making distances feel wrong. A mountain that looks close can take hours to reach. A trail that should be an easy loop can feel like it bends away from you every time you look up. But I knew this area. I knew the turns. I knew where the pavement cracked. I knew where deer like to stand and stare with their blank, patient faces. When I pulled into the parking area, the hiker's vehicle was still there. A dull-colored SUV, dust on the hood, leaves caught under the wipers. Nothing obviously disturbed. No broken glass. No signs someone else had rummaged through it. The kind of detail you'd be grateful for if you weren't trying to find a person. I checked the registration, confirmed the plates, took photos for the record, walked around the perimeter like I'd done 100 times before. Then I stood for a moment at the trailhead sign. It was one of those large wooden boards with the map and the warnings. Stay on trail, carry water. No fires. Wildlife is wild. Weather changes quickly. Don't approach cliffs. I've read those signs so many times they blur into one long sentence, but that morning I found myself lingering on the part about trails. Trails are supposed to be fixed. That's the agreement. That's the system. We maintain them. People follow them. Nobody disappears into places they're not supposed to be. I switched my radio to the local channel and did a check. My own voice came back in my ear, clean and steady. Everything normal. No static. No delay. Routine. I stepped onto the path. At first it was just hiking. Dirt underfoot, pine needles, the soft crunch of gravel. The air smelled like sap and cold stone. The trees were spaced wide enough for light to filter through, but the fog kept it muted. My breath came out in short clouds. The only sounds were my boots and the occasional distant creak of wood. That creak is normal too. Trees settle. Branches rub. Wooden signs shift. I passed the first marker about half a mile in. Standard blaze, reflective paint. It pointed forward, confirming the obvious. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. I moved at a steady pace, scanning for anything out of place. Broken branches, trash, footprints, signs of someone leaving the trail. A dropped bottle, a torn map. Anything. For the first hour, I found nothing. And that's when the unease started. Not because nothing was there, but because it was too clean. In a park this busy, something is always left behind. A wrapper, a tissue, a bent sign. Even if you never see the person, you see their presence, their mark, their mistake. This trail felt like it had been wiped. I looked down and saw footprints, but they weren't recent. They were softened by time. The edges blurred. A few deer prints, too. A faint indentation that could have been a boot, but I couldn't be sure. I kept walking. The forest began to tighten. The trees grew closer together, and the trail narrowed as it climbed. The fog thinned in patches, then thickened again, creating pockets where visibility dropped to a few yards. That's when the radio started to behave differently. Not a full failure, not even static, just a faint change in tone, like the signal was traveling through something denser than air. I stopped and adjusted the antenna, held it higher, turned slowly in a circle. The signal stabilized again. I told myself it was the terrain. Granite interferes. Valleys swallow transmission. That's all. Routine. But my voice sounded slightly wrong when I spoke again, like it was coming from a few feet behind me instead of from my mouth. I didn't like that thought, so I kept moving. About another quarter-mile in, the trail took a familiar bend around a large granite outcrop. I know this outcrop. It's a landmark. I've used it in directions. If you reach the stone face that looks like a broken tooth, you're close to the next junction. I saw the stone face through the fog, and I felt that small sense of relief that comes from recognition. Then I saw the sign. It was planted in the dirt just before the outcrop. A trail marker post, slightly crooked, with a reflective arrow. That alone wasn't strange. There are markers all over, but it was in the wrong place. It wasn't far wrong, not enough that a casual hiker would notice. It was just off, like a picture hung crooked on a wall you've stared at for years. I slowed. I stared at it for a long time. I walked up close and ran my fingers over the wood. Weathered. Old. Splinters. The reflective paint was dull, as if it had been there for seasons. It looked authentic. And yet I knew it hadn't been there yesterday, or the week before, or the last time I'd patrolled this trail. I stepped back, looked around for signs that someone had installed it. Fresh dirt. A shovel mark. Anything. Nothing. The ground around the post was packed and dry, as if it had always been part of the landscape. Pine needles had gathered around the base in a way that suggested time. That made no sense. I took out my phone and snapped a photo for documentation. I told myself someone might have moved it as a prank. A private group doing some kind of challenge. It happens. People get stupid in national parks. Especially the ones who think wilderness is a theme park. I exhaled and forced myself to move on. The arrow pointed forward, same direction I was already going. So maybe it was a replacement. Maybe the old marker had been removed and this was the new one. Maybe I'd missed the work order. Maybe another crew had been out here without notifying us. All of that was possible. I didn't like how possible it sounded, because it meant my memory could be wrong. Not real. Real. Not real. I walked past the marker and around the granite outcrop. On the other side, the trail dipped briefly into a shallow hollow. The fog pooled there, thicker, colder. It smelled faintly metallic, like wet stone. I kept my eyes on the ground, scanning for tracks. And then I saw them. Boot prints, clearer than anything I'd seen so far. They weren't deep, but they were crisp enough to show tread pattern. A modern hiking boot. Right size. Right spacing for someone walking at a moderate pace. My first thought was relief. Actual evidence. A direction, a line to follow. I crouched and compared the print to mine. Different tread. Not mine. I followed the prints with my eyes. They led forward. Then, after a few yards, they changed. Not in direction. In shape. The tread pattern shifted slightly, as if the same boot had suddenly become a different boot. Mid-stride. The spacing remained consistent. The path remained forward. But the print was not the same print. I stood up slowly. I told myself it was overlap. Older prints under newer ones. A trick of the light. The fog dampening the soil differently. I kept walking, keeping my eyes on the ground. The boot prints continued. They stayed just ahead of me, always a little faded by the time I reached them. As if they'd been made hours ago, not minutes. I adjusted my pace to catch up, and the prints remained the same distance ahead. That's the first moment I felt something like irritation return, sharp and strange. It felt like being led, not guided. Led. I radioed in my position, using a landmark and coordinates. My voice again sounded slightly delayed in my ear, but I ignored it. Dispatch replied normally. Routine. Still, I marked the boot prints and continued. The trail climbed toward the junction where it splits into two. One route leads back toward a main loop. The other drops into a quieter segment that runs along a series of small creeks. I knew which direction the missing hiker would most likely have taken. Most people choose the scenic route. Most people follow water. When I reached the junction, I saw the wooden signpost, and my stomach tightened, because there was a new marker there too. A second arrow fixed beneath the standard sign. Same reflective paint as the other, same weathered wood, pointing down the quieter segment. That segment is not officially closed, but it's not heavily trafficked. It's where you go if you want to be alone. It's where you go if you want silence. I stared at that arrow. Something about the way it caught the light felt wrong. Not the brightness, the angle, like it was catching light from a source that wasn't there. I looked up. The canopy was thick. The sky was a dull gray. There should have been no glint. I stood there longer than I should have. My training said one thing. My instinct said another. And in between those two, a third thought kept repeating, quiet as breath. Not real. Real. Not real. Finally, I did what rangers do. I followed the marker. The quieter segment of the trail always feels longer than it looks on the map. It descends gradually, not enough to notice at first, but enough that your knees register it before your eyes do. The trees grow closer together there, taller, older. Their branches knit overhead in a way that blocks the sky and makes the light feel filtered, diluted, like it's already passed through something else before it reaches you. As soon as I stepped past the junction, the temperature dropped. Not sharply, not dramatically, just enough that my breath changed, just enough that the inside of my jacket felt colder against my arms. I paused, glanced back toward the junction, and immediately felt foolish for doing so. The signs were still there. The official one, the unofficial one beneath it, both pointing the same way. I reminded myself that fear comes from uncertainty, and uncertainty comes from imagination filling in gaps. I had evidence now. Boot prints. A direction. That was good. That was grounding. I followed the prints. The trail narrowed further, the dirt giving way to patches of exposed root and stone. The fog here didn't lift the way it had earlier. It hung low, thickest near the ground, curling around the bases of trees like it was reluctant to leave them. I noticed the silence first. Not total silence. That would have been obvious. This was worse. This was selective. Birds would call once, then stop. Insects buzzed briefly, then cut off mid-sound. The forest felt like it was waiting for something to finish speaking. I checked my radio again. Still working. Still connected. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. The boot prints continued, steady and consistent. They crossed small streams without breaking stride. They stepped over fallen branches that hadn't been there the last time I walked this trail. I recognized the trees. I recognized the bends. But there were too many of them. Bends. Each curve felt like it repeated something I'd already passed. But not exactly. A boulder that looked familiar, but had a different crack running through it. A fallen log, positioned just a little differently. Ferns that should have been sparse, growing thick and tall. I told myself the trail maintenance crews must have been busy. I told myself seasonal changes could explain it. I told myself a lot of things. Then I noticed the marker. It stood on the left side of the trail, just beyond a bend. Same height. Same weathering. Same reflective paint. This one pointed forward. I stopped. I counted the distance in my head. There should not have been another marker here. Not this close. The spacing was wrong. The logic was wrong. I looked back down the trail, half expecting to see the previous marker behind me. I didn't. The trail behind me curved out of sight, swallowed by fog and trees. No marker. No signpost. Just dirt and roots. I stepped closer to the new marker. The wood felt cold when I touched it. Colder than the air. The paint was rough beneath my fingers, chipped in places, dulled in others. It had the same small notch near the base as the first one I'd noticed earlier. A shallow V-shaped cut, like someone had started carving something and stopped. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down the location, the time, the fact that this marker was not listed on the trail map. As I wrote, I became aware of something else. The boot prints didn't pass the marker. They ended just before it. I stared at the ground, then at the marker, then back at the ground. The prints stopped as if the person had stepped off the trail. But there were no prints leading into the brush. No disturbance. No broken twigs. No scuffed soil. They just stopped. I felt the first real flicker of fear then, sharp and unwelcome. I keyed the radio and reported the marker. I used neutral language. Unverified trail signage. Possible unauthorized place. I mentioned the boot prints stopping abruptly. Dispatch acknowledged. Asked me to continue cautiously. Cautiously meant carefully, not hesitantly. I reminded myself of that. I stepped past the marker. The trail ahead felt different underfoot, not in a way I could easily explain. The dirt was firmer. The roots felt more pronounced, like the ground had been pressed down recently. The fog thinned slightly, revealing more of the forest ahead. The trees seemed straighter here, more evenly spaced, almost intentional. That's when I realized the trail was quieter than it should have been. No wind, no water sounds, even though I knew there was a creek nearby. No distant calls, just my footsteps. I slowed my pace. With each step I felt more certain that I was being observed, not watched. Exactly. There's a difference. Watched implies eyes. This felt broader than that. Like the land was aware of my presence in the same way you're aware of a headache. Not focused on it, just conscious of it. I told myself that was nonsense. Not real. Real. Not real. The trail dipped again, then leveled out. Ahead, through the trees, I saw something pale. Another marker. This one stood in a small clearing no more than 10 yards across. The ground around it was bare, free of undergrowth, as if something had cleared it deliberately. Pine needles lay in a neat ring around the base of the post. There was no arrow on this one, just a flat face of wood. I approached slowly, my hand resting near my radio. The face of the marker was carved with letters. At first I thought it was just weathering, random scratches. But as I leaned closer, the shapes resolved into words. Names. Some were faint, some deeper, all carved by hand. I recognized 2 of them, not personally, from reports, from old case files. Missing hikers. People who had gone off trail. People who were never found. I felt my throat tighten. There were dates beside some of the names. Years, decades apart. The spacing was uneven, as if they'd been added whenever there was room. At the bottom of the list was a blank space. Not carved, not weathered, smooth. Waiting. I stepped back. My radio crackled, just once. Not static, just a brief burst of sound that almost formed a word. I raised it to my mouth and called dispatch again. This time my voice came back to me first. Delayed. Warped. Like it had traveled a longer distance than it should have. Dispatch responded a second later. Same words I'd just said. Repeated back to me. I didn't respond. I turned away from the marker and looked back down the trail. The marker I'd passed earlier was gone. In its place stood 2. Both pointed forward. My heart began to race, fast and loud, and I hated how obvious it felt in my chest. I took a slow breath and forced myself to think. Unauthorized installation didn't explain this. Pranks didn't explain this. Memory didn't explain this. But I was still standing on a trail, still in daylight. Still connected to the outside world, at least in theory. I told myself the most important thing was not to panic. I walked forward. As I passed between the 2 markers, I felt a strange pressure, like walking through a doorway that wasn't visible. My ears popped. The air shifted. For a moment I thought I smelt something old, not decay, something drier. Dust and sun. The trail ahead sloped gently upward. I followed it. Time became difficult to measure after that. My watch still worked, but the minutes felt stretched. The forest repeated itself in small ways. A fallen branch that appeared twice. A cluster of stones I stepped over more than once. Each time I noticed, I told myself it was coincidence. Each time, the thought came back. Quieter, more insistent. Not real. Real. Not real. I found another marker. Then another. They began appearing more frequently. At every bend, every slight change in elevation. Always pointing forward. Always forward. Eventually, I realized something else. The markers were no longer guiding the trail. The trail was adjusting to them. Roots curved away from the posts. Stones shifted to create clearer paths. The ground itself seemed more worn where the markers stood, as if the land had decided that this was the way now. I stopped again and turned in a slow circle. Every direction looked like forest. Dense. Endless. Except one. Straight ahead. Marked. I raised my radio one more time, not to call for help, but to hear something human. Something familiar. It clicked. Then silence. Not even my own voice came back this time. I lowered the radio. I stood alone on a trail I no longer recognized, surrounded by markers that hadn't been there before, pointing deeper into a part of Yosemite that felt less like wilderness and more like a record. I don't know how long I stood there before I moved again. I only know that I did. Because stopping felt worse. I don't remember deciding to keep going. That's the part that bothers me the most now. There should have been a clear moment, a conscious choice. Something I could point to later and say, that's where I made the mistake. But when I try to recall it, all I find is motion. One foot in front of the other. Breath in. Breath out. Trail ahead. The markers were closer together now. Close enough that I could see the next one before I passed the last. It felt excessive, like instructions being repeated to someone who couldn't be trusted to remember them. Forward. 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 The forest had changed again, though I couldn't say exactly how. The trees were taller here, their trunks straighter, their bark darker. The ground sloped unevenly, rising and falling in ways that made my sense of balance feel slightly off, like the trail had been built by someone who didn't quite understand gravity. I checked my watch. It said I'd been hiking for just under 3 hours. That wasn't possible. I should have reached the creek by now. I should have hit the turnaround point, or at least seen some familiar landmark that confirmed where I was. Even accounting for stops, even accounting for detours, the time didn't match the distance. I stopped walking. The silence pressed in immediately, thick and heavy. No wind. No distant water. Not even the soft creak of trees settling. I became aware of my own body in a way that felt intrusive. The weight of my pack, the tightness in my shoulders, the steady thump of my pulse in my ears. I waited. Nothing happened. No sounds returned. No birds resumed their calls. The forest remained still, as if pausing along with me. I took a step backward. The ground behind me felt resistant. Not solid, exactly. Just wrong, like stepping onto packed snow that hasn't frozen properly. I looked down. My boot print was shallow, incomplete, as if the earth hadn't fully accepted the pressure. I lifted my foot and placed it again, harder this time, same result. I stepped forward instead. The ground firmed instantly, supporting my weight without issue. I stood there, staring at my boots, a cold realization creeping in. The trail wanted me moving in one direction. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Panic would only make things worse. Panic narrows focus, and I needed clarity. Not real. Real. Not real. I resumed walking, keeping my eyes up now, scanning ahead instead of fixating on the ground. The next marker came into view quickly. Then, the next. Then another, spaced at intervals that felt almost conversational, like someone checking in repeatedly to make sure I was still listening. I began to notice details on the markers that I hadn't before. Small variations. Slight differences in the grain of the wood, in the shape of the arrows. Some were older than others. Some looked newly carved. The edges sharp, the surface lighter where the blade had cut. One of them had initials carved into the side. I recognized them. They belonged to a ranger who'd gone missing years before I transferred to Yosemite. His case was still used in training as an example of how quickly conditions could change in the backcountry. Sudden weather, steep terrain, simple mistakes. No body was ever recovered. I reached out and touched the initials. The wood felt warm. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. The trail narrowed again, funneling me between two massive trees whose branches tangled overhead. The light dimmed further, shifting from gray to something darker, flatter, like the world had lost depth. I tried my radio again. Nothing. Not even the click this time. Just dead weight in my hand. I told myself that meant I needed to mark my path manually. That's protocol. When technology fails, you leave signs, broken branches, stacked stones, anything that creates a record of your movement. I snapped a small branch and wedged it between two rocks at the edge of the trail. When I took 3 steps forward and looked back, it was gone. No broken branch, no disturbed rocks, no sign I'd ever stopped there. My stomach tightened. I tried again. This time I scratched an X into the bark of a nearby tree, shallow but visible. I walked forward, counted to 10, turned around. The tree was smooth. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the bark, my thoughts looping uselessly. The forest around me felt unchanged, unbothered by my confusion. Not real. Real. Not real. I noticed then that I was no longer tired. My legs should have been burning by now. My throat dry. My stomach empty. Instead I felt maintained, as if the usual signals had been muted or turned down. I was aware of hunger in an abstract way, like remembering that hunger exists without actually feeling it. That realization scared me more than the missing markers. It meant something was taking care of the basics. I walked on. The trail curved gently and opened into a wider space. Not a clearing exactly, more like a pause. The trees pulled back just enough to reveal a structure ahead. My first thought was relief. A ranger station. Small, wooden, single-story. The kind used decades ago before budgets shifted and maintenance became more centralized. I recognized the general shape, even if I couldn't place it. Except I should have known every station in this park. This one wasn't on any map. The building looked old, but intact. The wood was darkened by age, the windows dusty but unbroken. A faded emblem was carved above the door, its details softened by time. I approached slowly. There were no tracks leading to the building, no footprints, no tire marks. The ground around it was bare, like the clearing around the markers, unnaturally clean. I climbed the short steps and tried the door. It opened. Inside, the air was stale, dry, like a room that hadn't been opened in years, but also hadn't been sealed. Sunlight filtered through the windows in thin beams, illuminating dust that hung motionless in the air. There was a desk against one wall, a bulletin board covered in yellowed notices, a map pinned beneath cracked plastic. I stepped inside and felt the space close around me. The map drew my attention immediately. It was a map of Yosemite, but the trails were wrong. Some were missing. Some looped back on themselves in tight spirals. Others ended abruptly in blank space. The section I'd been walking through was there, but distorted, stretched, marked with far more detail than the surrounding areas. Tiny lines branched off it, like veins. I leaned closer. Along the trail were small symbols, markers, each one labeled, with names. I felt a tightness in my chest as I scanned the list. Hikers, climbers, backpackers, rangers. Some of the names were crossed out, others circled. A few were written more than once, the handwriting slightly different each time. Near the edge of the map, close to where I estimated my current position to be, was a new marking. No name yet, just a blank space, outlined in pencil. I stepped back, my foot bumping into the desk. Something fell to the floor with a dull thud. A logbook. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with entries. Dates spanning decades. Reports of patrols. Weather notes. Observations. The last entry stopped me cold. It was dated tomorrow. The handwriting was neat, familiar. It described my arrival. I closed the book. The silence inside the station felt heavier than it had outside, like the walls were listening. I backed toward the door, my mind racing, searching for something solid, something that made sense. That's when I noticed the markers outside. Through the window, I could see them now. Several of them, arranged in a loose semicircle around the building, all facing inward, pointing at me. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I stood there, staring, as a single thought surfaced and refused to leave. The trail wasn't leading me somewhere. It was documenting me. I don't remember leaving the station. There's no clear image of me opening the door, stepping down the stairs, or choosing a direction. When I try to recall it, my memory skips like a damaged recording. One moment I'm standing inside that dim room, staring at the map with my future penciled in. The next, I'm back on the trail. The forest closed around me again. What I do remember is the feeling. Reluctance, not fear exactly. Something closer to resistance. Like waking up when your body wants to stay asleep. Every movement heavy, delayed, negotiated. The markers were waiting. They had rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. I'm sure of it. The spacing was different now. Tighter. More deliberate. They formed a corridor instead of a suggestion, lining the path in pairs like sentries. I stood between them and listened. Still no wind. No animals. No distant water. Just my breathing, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of wood settling, as if the posts themselves were adjusting their weight in the ground. I took a step forward. The sound followed. Not footsteps, something lighter. A soft knock. Wood against wood. One tap, then another, slightly out of rhythm with my pace. I stopped. The sound stopped. I swallowed and forced myself to continue, every nerve tuned for movement that wasn't mine. The trail dipped again, steeper this time, and the forest changed with it. The trees grew thinner, their branches higher, leaving long empty stretches of trunk that reminded me of pillars in an abandoned building. I started to notice faces, not clearly, not fully formed, just impressions in the bark, knots that resembled eyes, cracks that suggested mouths. The longer I looked, the more they seemed to withdraw, flattening back into wood the moment I focused on them. Not real. Real. Not real. The trail curved sharply to the right, and I almost collided with a marker that hadn't been there a second earlier. This one was different. No arrow, just a single word carved deep into the wood. Wait. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Wait for what? Or who? I looked past the marker, down the trail ahead. It ended, not gradually, not at a clearing or a junction. It simply stopped, dissolving into dense undergrowth and shadow. No visible continuation, no obvious route forward. I turned back toward the marker behind me. It was closer now. Too close. Close enough that I could see fresh scratches along the side of the post, pale against the darker wood. I realized then that the corridor had narrowed. The markers on either side leaned inward slightly, reducing the space between them. I was being held in place. The sound started again. Tap, tap, tap. It came from behind me. Slowly, I turned. At first, I thought it was another marker being installed. That was the closest familiar explanation my mind could produce. Then I realized the shape was wrong. It stood too tall, too narrow. It moved without lifting its base from the ground, sliding forward in small increments, the sound coming from the bottom edge of the wood as it dragged itself closer. There was no arrow, no writing, just blank, weathered surface. I stepped back. The ground resisted me again, soft and uncooperative. My heel sank in deeper than it should have, like stepping into wet clay. The marker in front of me shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. It adjusted, turned slightly, reorienting itself so its blank face was angled toward mine. I felt an intense pressure behind my eyes, a headache blooming fast and sharp. Images crowded my thoughts, uninvited and overlapping. Trails I'd walked, names I'd read, faces I'd only seen on missing person posters. All of them walking, all of them following signs. I pressed my hands to my temples and squeezed my eyes shut. Not real. Real. Not real. When I opened them again, the marker was closer. I broke. Training vanished. Procedure vanished. I lunged forward, pushing past the weight marker and into the brush where the trail had ended. Branches snagged my clothes, scratched my arms. I didn't care. I needed distance. I needed anything that wasn't marked. The forest resisted me. That's the only word for it. Branches bent the wrong way. Roots rose underfoot. The ground sloped unnaturally, forcing me sideways, then back, funneling me toward the path I'd just left. I stumbled and fell, my hands slamming into the dirt. The sound echoed. Not outward, inward. The tapping stopped. I looked up. The markers were no longer behind me. They were around me, not in a circle, not evenly spaced, just close enough that every direction I looked, I saw wood. Posts emerging from the ground at irregular angles. Some leaning, some straight, all oriented toward me. Among them were different shapes now. Not posts. Figures. They stood where markers should have been, tall and narrow, their outlines blurred like something seen through fogged glass. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. But they felt present in a way the markers never had. I recognized one of them. The height. The posture. A ranger. The name surfaced unbidden. The same one I'd seen carved earlier. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if listening. Behind it, another shape shifted. Then another. The air grew thick, heavy with a sense of expectation. I understood then, without anyone telling me. This was the point. The moment where movement stopped being optional, where you either stayed, or you were placed. My gaze dropped to the ground in front of me. A post lay there, unfinished. Not yet upright. The wood was pale and smooth, the top unshaped. A faint V-shaped notch had been started near the base, matching the others I'd seen. It was waiting to be completed. I backed away, shaking my head, my thoughts dissolving into fragments. Not real. Real, not real. The figures didn't advance. They didn't need to. The ground beneath the unfinished post shifted, hardening, forming a shallow depression, perfectly sized. A place. I turned and ran. This time, the trail moved with me. Markers slid aside, opening a narrow path that hadn't existed before. The forest blurred as I pushed forward, lungs burning now, fatigue crashing in all at once like a debt being collected. The tapping returned, louder, faster, surrounding me. Tap, tap, tap. I ran until my legs gave out, until the light changed. Until the forest thinned abruptly, the trees falling away to reveal asphalt, painted lines, a familiar yellow divider. I collapsed at the edge of the road, my hands scraping pavement. The tapping stopped. Silence rushed in to replace it. I lay there, gasping, staring at the sky, which looked wrong in its openness. Voices came later. Shapes. Hands. Someone asked me my name. I didn't answer. Because for a moment, I wasn't sure it still belonged to me. They told me later that I was found just before dusk, sitting upright on the shoulder of the road like I'd been placed there. Not collapsed, not sprawled, my back straight, my hands resting on my knees, my eyes open, waiting. That part doesn't feel real when I hear it repeated back to me. It doesn't match how I remember waking up. In my memory, there's no clean transition, no relief, just a thinning, like the world slowly remembered me and decided to let me back in. The first thing I noticed was sound. Wind in the trees. Distant traffic. A bird calling and being answered by another. Too much sound. Overwhelming after the long, controlled silence of the trail. I blinked until the shapes around me made sense. Flashing lights. 2 park vehicles pulled over at odd angles, a small group of people standing a few feet away, watching me carefully, like I might break if they moved too fast. Someone said my name. It felt strange hearing it spoken out loud. Heavy. Unfamiliar. I tried to respond, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. My tongue felt thick, unresponsive, like it had forgotten its job. I swallowed a few times before sound finally came out, thin and hoarse. They asked where I'd been. I didn't answer. They asked how long I'd been out there. I didn't answer that either, because time had stopped meaning anything. According to them, I'd been missing for 3 days. 72 hours. Search teams had been deployed. Helicopters. Dogs. Infrared sweeps at night. My last radio transmission had placed me on a section of trail that, according to their maps, didn't connect to any road. According to them, I shouldn't have been where they found me. According to them, I was lucky. I remember being helped to my feet, guided toward one of the vehicles. My legs trembled violently. the delayed exhaustion finally asserting itself. Every muscle burned. My joints ached like they'd been overused and under-rested. Inside the vehicle, the world felt too small, the ceiling too low, the air too stale. I fought the urge to press my hands against the windows, to make sure the glass was real. One of the medics handed me a bottle of water. I drank without thinking. The water tasted flat and distant, like it was going somewhere else before it reached me. I emptied the bottle too quickly and immediately felt sick, my stomach rebelling against the sudden reminder that it existed. They wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I didn't remember feeling cold. As we drove back toward the station, the road unspooled ahead of us in long, gentle curves. Familiar turns, familiar landmarks, everything where it should be. That should have comforted me. Instead, I found myself watching the roadside with intense focus, scanning for anything out of place. A sign, a post, a marker where there shouldn't be one. Every time we passed a trailhead, my breath caught. But everything looked normal. Not real. Real. Not real. At the station, they asked me to write a statement. I stared at the blank page for a long time. How do you describe a trail that doesn't exist on the map but exists anyway? How do you explain markers that move when you're not looking? How do you put into words the feeling of being sorted? I wrote the basics. Times. Locations. The last point where I'd had radio contact. The rest, I left vague. Disorientation. Possible dehydration. Memory gaps. They accepted it. People want explanations that fit inside boxes. They want causes they can understand. Exposure, fatigue, stress. Those are familiar. Those are safe. No one pushed me to say more. I think part of them didn't want to hear it. The official report concluded that I'd become disoriented due to environmental conditions and navigational error, that I'd likely followed an unofficial game trail before eventually finding my way back toward the road. Case closed. I was placed on medical leave. At first, the quiet was a relief. No radio, no patrol schedule, no early mornings. I slept for hours at a time, dreamless and heavy, like my body was making up for something it had lost. But when I was awake, I felt wrong, disconnected, like I'd been returned slightly out of alignment. I started noticing things, small things. A trail sign near the visitor center that pointed a degree or two off from where it used to. A post near the parking lot that looked newer than the others, its wood lighter, the grain too clean. I told myself maintenance had been busy. I told myself I was projecting. But the thought returned anyway. Not real. Real. Not real. I avoided the backcountry at first, stayed inside, filed paperwork, answered phones, told myself it was temporary. Then one afternoon, I was asked to walk out to the edge of the lot to check on a delivery truck that had missed its turn. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was halfway across the pavement when I saw it. A trail marker just beyond the tree line, barely visible between two trunks. Same height, same weathering, same reflective paint catching light from no clear source. It hadn't been there that morning. I froze. Cars passed behind me. Voices drifted from the visitor center. Life went on, loud and unbothered. The marker stood quietly, waiting. I didn't approach it. I didn't point it out to anyone else. I went back inside and shut the door. That night, I dreamed of walking a trail that looped endlessly through the same clearing. Every time I reached the center, another marker appeared, closer than the last. When I woke up, my boots were by the door. They were worn down in a pattern I didn't recognize. The soles scuffed smooth in places they shouldn't have been. The tread shallow, as if they'd been dragged rather than lifted. I hadn't worn them since I'd been found. I moved them into the closet. They were back by the door the next morning. I started writing this after that, not as a report, not as a confession, as a record. Because the markers are closer now. I see them from my window sometimes, at the edge of the trees. I don't look directly at them anymore. I've learned that lesson. But I can feel them adjusting. Making space. I stopped telling people what I was seeing. Not because it stopped happening. Because I understood finally that saying it out loud made it more real. The first time I tried to explain, it was to another ranger. Someone I trusted. Someone who'd been in the park almost as long as I had. We were standing near the maintenance shed, talking about nothing important, when I noticed a marker at the tree line behind him. It wasn't close, but it was closer than it had been yesterday. I asked him if he saw it. He followed my gaze, squinting into the trees, then shook his head. Said he didn't see anything unusual, just forest. While he was talking, the marker shifted. Not much, just enough that the reflective paint caught the light and flashed. I flinched. He noticed that. That was the moment his expression changed. The moment concern crept in. The moment I realized I'd made a mistake. After that, the questions started. Sleep. Appetite. Stress. Had I been feeling detached? Had I experienced gaps in memory? I learned quickly which answers kept the conversation short. Inside, though, things were getting worse. The trail followed me now. Not physically. Not in a way anyone else could track. But in small, persistent intrusions. A signpost shape reflected in a dark window. A wooden edge visible at the corner of my vision. Gone when I turned my head. I started counting markers in my dreams. They always appeared in odd numbers. I also started noticing names. Not carved into wood anymore, written where they didn't belong. Scribbled into the margins of pamphlets. Etched faintly into the condensation on the inside of my windshield. Always names I recognized. People who hadn't come back. Sometimes, when I was very tired, I'd see my own. Misspelled. Not real. Real. Not real. I avoided hiking trails entirely. I took longer routes between buildings. I stayed on pavement whenever possible. Concrete felt safer. Predictable. It didn't adjust itself when you weren't looking. But even pavement has edges. One evening, as I was locking up, I noticed something new near the far end of the lot. A post. Not fully shaped yet. Just a length of wood sunk partway into the ground, unmarked, unpainted. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't move. That scared me more than if it had. Over the next few days, it changed slowly. A little at a time. A smoothed edge here. A shallow notch there. As if someone was working on it patiently, invisibly. I stopped parking near that end of the lot. At night, I dreamed less. When I did dream, it was always the same moment. Standing at a junction, one path wide and empty, the other narrow and marked. In the dream, I never remembered which one I'd taken before. I started waking up with dirt under my fingernails. That's when I decided to record this. Not to warn anyone. I don't think warnings help. The people who need them never hear them in time. And the people who hear them convince themselves it won't happen to them. I'm recording this because things that aren't written down don't exist for long. Because trails are systems. And systems need records. Because if I disappear again, I don't want the only evidence to be a post in the ground. The marker near the lot is finished now. It has an arrow. It points toward the road. Toward where I was found last time. I haven't told anyone about it. I think that's part of the test. I don't know how much longer I have before I'm expected to move again. Before standing still stops being an option. If you're listening to this, and you hike, and you see a trail marker where you don't remember one, don't assume it's helping you. Because some trails don't lead out, they lead back. Or worse, they lead you into the system. I'm not recording this from anywhere official. Not the station. Not my apartment. Not anywhere that would make sense on paper. The location isn't important anymore. That's something I've learned. Places stop mattering once the trail decides you're part of it. Once your movement becomes expected. I can hear it now, even as I speak. Not footsteps. Not wind. Adjustment. Wood settling. Distance correcting itself. The marker outside has moved again. It's closer to the building than it was yesterday. Close enough now that I can see the grain of the wood clearly through the glass. The shallow V-shaped notch at the base is deeper than it was before. Cleaner. More confident. Like someone knows where it belongs. I've stopped trying to measure time. My watch still works, but it lies in a way I can't prove. Hours pass too quickly. Nights stretch. Sometimes the light outside doesn't change at all. Just dulls slightly. Like someone turning a dimmer instead of flipping a switch. People still talk to me. That's the strangest part. They still ask how I'm doing. They still hand me paperwork. They still expect answers. On the surface, nothing has changed enough to raise alarms. But conversations feel one-sided now, like I'm slightly out of phase with them. They speak. I respond. And somewhere in between, something goes missing. Names slip first. Then dates. Then details I know I used to care about. I caught my reflection in a window earlier and didn't recognize the posture. Too still. Too balanced. Like I'd been positioned deliberately. Not real. Real. Not real. I've tried leaving. I packed a bag 2 nights ago. Just essentials. Clothes. Water. My phone. I told myself I'd drive until the park was far enough behind me that the trees thinned and the road straightened. I made it to the car. The engine started. The moment I put it in reverse, the marker appeared in the rearview mirror. Not behind the car. Behind me. Inside the reflection. I turned around. Nothing was there. When I looked forward again, my phone was gone from the passenger seat. In its place was my old map. The one from the station. Folded open to the wrong section. I turned the engine off. I unpacked the bag. The bag is still by the door. Sometimes I think about the unfinished post I saw on the trail. The one meant for me. I wonder if this is what it feels like before the last step. Before the ground hardens and the space decides. Because the markers aren't hostile. That's another thing people wouldn't understand. They're patient. They don't rush. They don't chase. They wait for you to align yourself. For you to stop resisting the direction that's been laid out. I think that's why so many people disappear without signs of struggle. They aren't taken. They arrive. I've started finding things arranged for me. Small considerations. My boots cleaned and set neatly by the door. Water refilled without me remembering doing it. Pages of this recording transcribed in handwriting that looks like mine, but steadier. More certain. The phrase repeats more often now, without me starting it. Not real. Real. Not real. Last night, I woke up standing. That alone should tell you enough. I was upright in the middle of the room, feet planted, arms at my sides. I don't remember getting out of bed. I don't remember opening my eyes. I was just there, facing the window. The marker was directly outside, close enough that I could see where the arrow would go once it was painted, pointing inward. I didn't move. Neither did it. We stayed like that for a long time, the space between us thinning, not in distance, but in difference. Like the air itself was deciding whether it still needed to separate us. I think that's when I understood what the system really is. It's not the forest. It's not the park. It's not even the trail. It's continuity. A way of making sure nothing truly leaves. A way of ensuring that everyone who enters is accounted for, categorized, given direction. Some people become names. Some become warnings. Some become markers. Rangers are useful because we already know how to stand still, how to point, how to direct others without moving ourselves. I don't know when I stopped being searched for and started being prepared. I don't know when the trail decided I fit. The marker is at the door now, not touching it. Just close enough that I don't need to open it to know where I'm supposed to go next. If someone finds this recording, if it's played back somewhere far from here, understand this isn't a warning. It's a status update. The trail doesn't need belief. It doesn't need fear. It only needs movement. And eventually, that part becomes optional. I can hear the wood settling again. Closer. I think the arrow is finished.